Matthew Collins works with an organisation in the UK called Hope Not Hate. And they do amazing work in the field of challenging racism, being anti-racist, challenging extreme views, challenging hate. And as it says here, showing people the power of hope and how that can overcome hate. So we're going to speak to Matthew now, who joins us all the way from England. And I'm going to interview Matthew, so I'll stop the share and we're just going to find out a little bit about Matthew's journey to having worked, to doing the work he does with this organisation now. So Matthew, thank you so much.
My pleasure. My pleasure.
Thank you for joining us. So many people here might have seen your recent appearance on the Tommy Tiernan show, so you'll be a familiar face to a lot of people. Yep. So Matthew, I mentioned that you're joining us today from London. You grew up there in South London in a very multicultural way, lots of nationalities living side by side. Can you tell me a little bit about what that was like to grow up in that kind of environment? You know, what was school like?
Well, I'm getting old, so I look back on everything I've done and everything I've experienced differently, because obviously you acquire different tastes. But looking back on it, I think it was actually a brilliant place to grow up, and very diverse, and you learned new things, new smells, new sounds, new names, you heard new languages. But at the time, this is 1970s, but predominantly the 1980s, I rejected a lot of that. I didn't want to grow up in a society like that. I wanted to grow up in a society that had all the same skin color as me and spoke only the same language as me. So at the time, I hated it, absolutely hated it. And all these things that now I think are brilliant and good for people to experience, I didn't want to experience them.
And Matthew, you have Irish connections?
Yes, yes. 40% of people in England have a relative in Ireland, cousins, aunts, great uncles. My father was born in Cork, hence I'm wearing the Cork colours this morning. And he came as an immigrant to England after the war, after the Second World War, in the 1940s. He came to England, so that's my Irish connection.
And were you ever aware, growing up in London in the 80s, were you ever aware of Irish people receiving racism? And
yes, absolutely. And I'm sure there'll be people here who have relatives who may have lived or worked in England during the 1980s who would tell them quite horrific stories about the way that the Irish were categorized and treated by the English. And my father experienced it from the moment he arrived in England in the 1940s, and then growing up in the 1950s and 1960s through to even now, quite recently, Irish people can still face discrimination. And you know, the story of London, where I'm from, is that the whole city is built on or built by immigrants, starting from the Romans who came to London and showed us how to bathe and how to flush away our toilets, and through to the schools and the hospitals and the motorways and the new housing that we had in the 70s and the 80s when our government did build homes. They were almost exclusively built by Irish people. So the English hadn't particularly treated the Irish people very, very well, and that's something that the English are very, very conscious of historically, but they don't necessarily understand why. And there's a very famous expression, "No blacks, no dogs, no Irish," which people may be aware of. And sometimes even I find it hard to believe, but yeah, a lot of when Irish people came to England, invited to England to help rebuild it, they couldn't even find places to live because they, you know, like black people who were invited to our country to build it, people didn't want them in their houses because they didn't know them, they had never spoken to them, didn't know anything about their lives or their stories or their dignities. And one of the jokes that my father and his brothers always told me was, "I don't understand why English people didn't like dogs." So, you know, even in that adversity, there was always humor. But I
Yeah.
think it's about, my father died at Christmas,
Mm.
and at his funeral there was a lot of people, old Irish people who came from Cork or had never gone home, and that was the prime experience that they spoke about, was the experience of the Irish in England.
Mm. Thank you for that, Matthew. That's really insightful. So then let's just kind of fast forward. We'll say you've already mentioned that from a young age, you felt like you didn't want to be surrounded by this multiculturalism. So when you were 12 or 13, as an awful lot of teenagers do, you kind of went looking for your place in the world, looking for your identity. And of course, your identity had that Irishness in it as well. Could you talk to us then about what those years were like, as I suppose hatred kind of took root for you?
Well, a massive hatred took root. The only way to describe it was, I grew up in a home without a father. Of course, my father was Irish, and he decided at some stage he had better things to do in a big city like London than stay indoors with my brothers and my mother and I. And I had a sense of loss, and something you see and hear in a lot of racists is this idea about loss. And normally it's about things that they never had or never experienced, but still have a sense of loss about it. And my sense of loss was about an absent father, I guess, missing links to a wider family, the Irish part of the family, my father's family. And I decided that this sense of loss wasn't down to necessarily my father's other external interests, but was down to something that had been stolen from me. And that theft was by, again, people of color, people with different color skin to me, people who might have spoken different languages in the home, people who might have eaten different food to me. And I hated them for that, because I think I saw them as just having something I didn't have.
Mm.
And I developed a almost pathological hatred for people of color.
Mm. Which is very toxic for a young person to have to deal with that emotion.
Yes, and I wouldn't advise anybody to try it. It's so it's almost debilitating.
Mm.
One of the things about, I guess, somehow you might feel you're an outsider, is then to go looking for other people who felt the same, and then you're surrounded by hatred. I've called it a bubble a number of occasions. You find yourself in this bubble of absolute hatred, and it is comforting, right up until the point where you realize life has passed you by, and
Mm.
everybody else you knew, all of your peers, have moved on with their lives and are out experiencing new things and better things, things that make them more intelligent than you, more outgoing. And of course, it's very difficult to meet a young woman, as I desperately wanted to do, when you hang around with grumpy men who hate women and black people the whole time. It's very difficult to get by in society when you don't know anything about music, television, or film, because there's too many black people in music, television, and films for your liking.
Wow. So when you came to the realization then, years later, maybe in your early 20s, I think it was, Matthew, when you realized, I'm living in a bubble world, this is not helping me, I'm not solving anything, I need to get out.
Yeah.
The hatred didn't just switch off, obviously. So
No.
how did you kind of work, pull up those roots and work that out for yourself? And did you have people who helped you?
Yeah, well, of course you could all buy my books on Amazon, but to give you the cheap answer, I part of this hatred meant that I took part in some absolutely horrific things. And one of the things that underpins hatred is violence, the threat of violence and the actuality of violence. And I saw and did some things that even shocked myself. I had a modicum of decency left in me. And it's the organization I work for now, really, that I went to and told them what I was doing and what I had done. And I carried on amongst my hateful friends and brethren to pass information that would then help the organization I work for now undermine them, to stop these people taking foothold in society, but also to stop these people from telling other lies about other people. Because racism is born out of an ignorance, but it's also born out of a fear. My fear about losing out and missing things and being excluded from society. But it's very, very, I think it's very, very seductive for people. And so my organization, the Arts organization, our raison d'etre is to actually undermine these people. And so that's what I started to do. But I didn't become an anti-racist overnight, even though I sort of rejected fascism. I didn't really experience proper anti-racism until I became an immigrant myself. I went to live in Australia, not the same as people who arrive in desperation in places like Britain and Ireland, but I still had to go to the back of every queue. I still had to be excluded, and I ended up working with Vietnamese people, of all people, and Vietnamese people in Australia were also the same as the Vietnamese people I tormented in London when I was at school. And I saw their lives as immigrants. I worked with them, their sense of family, their sense of community, and their sense of hope. And then realized that I'd spent years and years desperately trying to deny these people their hope, their dreams, and their dignity. And that's when I began to understand why, as you pointed out earlier, it's not enough to say, well, I'm not racist anymore. How actively and acutely can I be an anti-racist?
Thank you for that. So it was when you saw the lived experience, when you yourself were displaced,
yep,
and you saw the lived experience, that you had that change of heart. So to talk about the work you do now, Matthew, the really, really vital and important work with Hope Not Hate.
yep.
Are you in a position to support young people who are at risk of hate now, and what kind of work do you do with them?
Well, primarily my job is to work with people who are, I guess, have overstepped the mark. So I tend to work with people of all ages who are already engaged in and active in some rather extreme and obviously quite dangerous organizations. But as a whole, the work that Hope Not Hate does, I mean, I'm not the only one there. Sometimes it feels like it, as you can see, the Friday office. But as an organization, we're completely dedicated, first of all, to undermining fascists, but also to understand what the triggers are and how racism takes hold. Obviously, now in an environment of social media, it quite often takes hold and takes seat by people flooding our online environments with lies and half-truths and scare stories. And so Hope Not Hate's work is, in schools, an education department totally dedicated to this. But also, we don't come at things from a complete and condemning position. We understand how and why people are sucked into racism. We understand that. And it's unraveling and challenging that. That is the biggest challenge. How do you persuade people to see, and particularly in very, very challenging environments and circumstances, how do you persuade people and encourage people to cling to hope, to find hope? Because hope is a challenge in itself when we're completely surrounded by darkness and hatred. It's encouraging the good people to stand up, and we want to be there to turn people on that, without wishing to sound like a religious epiphany. But how do we get people to find that route out, and the light and the way forward to live better lives?
Mm-hmm. And I was really interested in that. A part of that is building communities. And there was a line that struck me: making people want to belong to their communities, rather than isolating themselves.
Yeah, again, my own experience was feeling isolated, but I wasn't isolated. I just, do you have the courage to stand up and say, I want to belong? Do you have the courage to engage? Just some people spend, years and years like a wallflower, just watching things and wishing they were involved, or they don't get involved. Part of that is, as well, we do some training, but also encouraging people to go to others. How do you go to others and say, do you want to be involved? Can you be involved with this? Do you have something to share? This is something you want to learn. So it's not just about getting people to stand up and say, get me involved. It's about getting people to go out and go to others, and community, community is strong, community resilience all throughout history, all parts of history. You'll see when communities are stronger, that they can resist many things, many things.
Yeah. Matthew, thank you so much for your insights and for sharing this experience. Could I ask you to maybe just with our young people, we have 65 classrooms or schools logged on here, if you have a short message of hope for the young people who are listening today.
Yes, and good morning everyone in Cork. You know, I get asked this sometimes. I always want to say something really profound, and for some reason it just ends up being rather disturbing. Look, you might have noticed I'm very old. I don't have a beard like Mr. Malone. I tried to grow one, I can't. The only thing you have for definite and for certain is dignity, and you will, at various times and stages in your life, you'll lose it, normally because you fall in love with the wrong person. But you will have it with you forever and ever. And so do other people. And to deny them theirs or attack it or try and take it away from them is the most terrible and horrible thing you can do without knowing them and understanding them. Truth is the most important thing. Yes, question everything, but also believe in something. Believe in yourselves, believe in your neighbors, believe in your communities, and believe in the good in other people. And that's all you can ever do and ask of yourselves.